Welcome everybody to our second webinar. Tonight we're going to be looking at ARCPs, the annual review of competency progression and the arrangements we've got in place for the summer 2020. Now we have a number of different individuals with me tonight to help answer your questions. We have Adrian Brooke, who's the Deputy Medical Director in HEE. We have Jane Mamelock, who's one of HEE's regional postgraduate deans, but also the main editor of the Gold Guide. We have Colin Melville, who's the Director of Education from the GMC, and we have the Chief Executive, Alistair Henderson, and the Chair, Carrie McEwen, of the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges. So we hope at the end of this session that you will have had all your questions about the moderated ARCP process that we're running this year answered. Now, we're very grateful that some of you sent us the questions in advance, so we had time to think about them. But there's also an opportunity for you to ask further questions as you go through the webinar. And you do this by going on to the Slido website and entering the event code hashtag HEEARCP, all uppercase. I know that this is an opportunity to ask us lots of questions, but please can you limit them to the ARCP, because that's what we want to cover this time. If there's other subjects you want us to cover, you can note that and we can arrange that for further webinars, but we won't actually answer the questions tonight. And one of the other things we can't do is answer individual questions about your personal circumstances. So if you want information, if you can ask a broader question, then that's easy for us to answer while we're online. So we will also record this so you can access it across the social channels in case you have to go and make a cup of tea in the middle or in case you have to miss a bit. So I'll now hand over to Colin Melville from the GMC to give you a view from his perspective about the work that we've been doing together on the ARCP process. Over to you, Colin.
Thanks, Shona, and good evening, everyone. It's always a bit strange, isn't it, when I'm looking into a camera here and I have no idea how many of you are out there, but it's really good that you've dialed in, and I hope this is a really beneficial session for you. I've made some notes, so I hope you don't mind. Every now and then I might just glance down. Let me just start by saying, you know, this is a very strange time, and none of us who've been around for a long time have seen anything like this in the past, and I hope we never see anything like it again, of course. But we do realise it's been a huge challenge, and we recognise the impact it's going to have for some of you, if not more of you, in terms of your own well-being. But we're hugely grateful, and I think you've seen that public outpouring as well, hugely grateful for your willingness to step up, whether you're on the front line, you know, actually dealing with patients, or you're in the background doing remote consultations, or however you've been asked to position yourself. It's just been an absolute privilege to see the way in which the NHS has responded, and that includes you as trainees. So we recognise that, you know, there's been some challenges in this, and for various different groups, sometimes whole groups, sometimes small groups, there have been some different challenges. And as we run up towards the end of the year, really anxious that we do all we can as the regulator to have the minimal impact on you in terms of training, and recognise where we can the ability to progress. And that's work that's been going on in the background with colleagues who are on this call and many others across the academy, the colleges, the education bodies, in order to make it all possible. So I hope that we've achieved our objective, but it might be worth just pointing out just a few things where the GMC's role has been really quite important for this. So number one, in order to try and limit the impact on people, we suspended the whole issue around revalidation. Now, I know for many of you that's something perhaps more in the future, but I think that was an additional point that would be really helpful. And at the same time, in order not to interrupt training, we extended the trainer recognition program so that your supervisors wouldn't somehow and suddenly fall foul of a technical hitch. And then you may have noticed that we didn't run the National Training Survey. There are lots of reasons why that's really useful, and we're really keen to hear your voice, and I know all the postgraduate deans are too, but we felt this was not the right time to do that, and we checked with other people who agreed. So we may run a very short version, like a pulse survey, a bit later this year in order to just try and gauge what impact it's had, but that we suspended. We also took a number of steps, as you'll know, to try and make sure we had the maximum number of doctors available, but in a safe way and in a safe deployment. So the fact that many of our medical schools were able to graduate their students early and develop this novel program of Foundation Interim Year 1 required our role as regulator to make that possible. And I think it's been a really great example of how the medical schools, the education bodies, GMC and others have all worked together to make that possible. Probably not many of that group of people perhaps on this call, but you'll appreciate, I'm sure, the work that they have done in that. The other area which obviously has mattered quite a lot, and I don't know how many of you realise this, at the moment there are 103 different specialty curricula, all of which we have to approve. And that has required us to do some slightly nifty footwork in order to be able to make sure that it has the least impact on training as is possible. And for that, we adopted 3 basic principles. The first and overarching one was that patient safety must come first. So no decisions were made where we felt that patient safety may be compromised. The second, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, is that this country's medical profession is highly regarded internationally, not just in the UK. And it was important that in order that we protect the public, that we maintain our standards. And so that was our second principle. And then after that, the third was that we didn't want people to look to make compromise or what we call derogations or mitigations in curricular decisions, and indeed in ARCP decisions, that couldn't be justified on a temporary basis if actually they could be made on a permanent basis. So we've pushed quite hard to make sure that that is considered in those decisions. Now, a lot of that has happened perhaps in the background, but really important in order that we can work with trainees and with education bodies, deans and others in order to make sure training can progress. So wherever possible, we have tried to facilitate that progression through the next stage of training can take place unless it comes up against one of those 3 principles. And I know the education bodies and in particular HE in this context have done some fantastic work to try and work out how we do that. And that's why we introduced this rather perhaps slightly odd new ARCP derogation, outcome 10, of which detail I think from other people, I'm sure that will come. So there's still plenty to do, and we're still receiving that. I hold a placeholder in my diary every week now to look at curricular approval changes that are required on an urgent basis. Many of you will know we've worked really hard with the College of GPs not to impact on CCT, and there's still work ongoing to deliver that, which is really exciting. And then we've been working in other specialty areas too. So this is a credit to everyone and to you for your patience. So thank you. Look forward to the rest of this call and let's see what comes up. And in the meantime, keep faith, keep hanging in there, and we will do all we can to work on your behalf to secure your future. So I think I'm going to pass back to Shona again.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin, for that view from the regulator. I'm going to ask Professor Carrie McEwen to give us some insights from the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges who've been working so closely with us on this. So over to you, Carrie.
Thank you, Shona, for that introduction, and thank you, Colin, for setting the scene. I think that I would echo everything that Colin has said, particularly around about the challenging times that everybody has faced. And these challenges have not simply been within the world of clinical medicine, they have been there to ensure that trainees get the best that they can out of this. And recognising how difficult it has been, posed by issues like redeployment, lack of time for formal training, therefore the inability ability to reach your own curricular competencies, and adding to that a lack of exam diets, then that has made life very difficult for people to continue within the training programmes and progress as they would like to see. So for that very reason, we have worked very, very closely with the postgraduate deans, with HEE, with the GMC, and we most certainly have worked very closely with each individual college and their specialties, and particularly getting input from trainees. Trainees as a group and trainees individually in specialties to identify not only overarching principles around about any changes that we want to make in order that people can progress, but also looking at individual specialties and what the individual things may mean for them, because we all recognise that we're all different. But we have to stick by the important things. If people are allowed to progress, then it has to be because of what COVID, the impact that COVID has had, and it has to make sure that under all circumstances that we put patient safety first and we maintain the standards that we have. So with that in mind, we've ensured that where possible, nobody is disadvantaged by this pandemic, which has caused so much disruption. And particularly within training, allowing people to progress where possible. And that's been at all levels, from medical school to foundation, from foundation to core, core to specialty, and specialty to CCT and beyond. A key part of that has been the ability to make sure that the ARCP process is able to progress. So that is what we've been doing. We will hear more about it, about the details around about the new outcome 10s, and what this might mean for people. And I'd just like to assure you that each college and each specialty is working very hard to make sure that we continue to support the future of each and every specialty within medicine. So I'll now hand back to Shona, who will start, I think, the process of giving us a bit more detail. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to take the credit for giving you more detail, but it's not actually me that's going to give the detail. I'll pass over to Adrian, who has been working on this, to give some context to the work we're doing, and then we'll move on to Jane Mamelock. Adrian, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Shona, and good evening, everyone, and thank you again for joining on where I am is rather a cold and miserable night, uncharacteristically, but I think I'd echo everyone else's thoughts just to kick off with about really how thankful we all are for the amazing efforts that everyone has made, and the way everyone has pulled together is it's truly humbling. In a way, you sort of sometimes forget why you do a job, and then you see stuff like this and it reminds you of all the good. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the effort that people have gone to, that trainees have gone to, that your faculty as senior clinicians have gone to as well, to try and make sure that everyone can pull together through this really hard time. And this of course includes the ability to assess how we're getting on in training as learners. So we realised pretty early on that we had this unprecedented pandemic, and early projections were somewhat frightening, let's just say, and we had to make plans for a very straitened set of circumstances where we wouldn't have the ability to operate normally. And it's against that background that HEE, the other nations and their statutory education bodies, the GMC and also the colleges have all worked together to try and come up with these answers to help you progress wherever possible. So we knew that the pandemic has stopped people on taking normal curriculum, so it would stop you maybe getting all your normal opportunities to attain your capabilities and competencies. We also had to modify the arrangements for ARCP because we had to be compliant with public health advice. But not only that, in line with the ARCP review that we had done in HEE as part of the Improving junior doctors' working lives. So that all fed into a really different model of running ARCPs this year. And part of that includes what we've asked you to do to help with this sort of slimmed down version of ARCPs to accommodate these really seismic changes. And one of these is the use in England only, of what's called a self-declaration form. For most trainees, that accepts those in dental training or foundation training. But it's effectively a supportive document. It asks you to really assess yourself about how you're getting on, where you think you are, how you think you're progressing. It asks specifically about how you are, where you are as a person, and gives you the opportunity really to just have a think about how your resilience and other mechanism have kind of managed over this period. Now, the really important thing for you as learners is you don't want this impact, which is not due to anything that you have done, to impact unfairly on your chances of progressing. So we've been working with the Royal Colleges and the GMC and the other nations to really develop this new framework. We've had to do this really very quickly. We have something called the Gold Guide, which Jane will talk about soon. That's developed over years and years and undergoes careful and deliberative iteration over many months between editions. These changes we've had to bring around in just a few weeks under tremendous pressure of time. And so it is, I think, still partially a work in progress. And there may be changes yet to come, depending on what happens in the future. But we are committed to ensuring that no one is disadvantaged during this process. Some of the questions that you've asked tonight have come up several times from several different parties, and we will use this to really furnish a frequently asked questions page, which I think we'll try and distribute through the colleges and through the academy and through our own website, again as a way of helping you as learners and you as faculty really understand some of the detail. And this is where I'll now pass you on to Jane Mamelog, who is the editor-in-chief of the Gold Guide, who can explain in much more detail now about the ARCP changes we put in place for this year, in particular the outcome 10. So I'll hand you over to Jane. Jane.
Okay, thank you, Adrian, and good evening, everybody. And what I hope to do in this short session of mine is just to give you a little bit of the background of what we were trying to achieve in making the ARCP process as normal as possible, but recognising the impact that COVID has had on your training and any disruption. So I will explain in detail about how we developed the outcome 10, what it actually means, and then if the technology allows us, we're going to put just one simple flowchart on the screen, and I will then talk you through the process of how we decide and which outcome 10.1 or 10.2 to use. So the aim when we were asked to look at the ARCPs and whether we needed to make any adjustments to the Gold Guide was to make the assessments and your progression as normal as possible, and wherever possible to allow you to progress as you would expect during your training, and to be able to mitigate for any impact that the COVID has had on your ability to gain any required competencies and achieve those critical progression points. And to recognise that this has happened through no fault of your own. It's been completely outside everybody's control, that the impact that COVID has had. So in response to that, we developed what we called a no fault outcome 10. And the 4 nation statutory educational bodies agreed to the derogation of Gold Guide 8 4.91, and that's where the ARCP outcomes are listed and described. So although it's an outcome 10 and everybody calls it the outcome 10 derogation, it's actually a derogation from Goal Guide 8. And what the aim of the outcome 10 was that it acknowledges that satisfactory progress overall has been made. But there are some capabilities and competencies that you haven't been able to acquire, and that is because your training has been disrupted in some way and affected by COVID. And really importantly, that as a result of that, additional training might be required. And I stress might because, again, when we come to look at the outcome 10, not all cases will require additional time. So when we develop the derogation, we use the wording and the format so it looks exactly like all the other outcomes described in the goal guide. And the outcome 10, I am actually just going to read you how we defined the outcome 10. Its classification is achieving progress and the development of competencies or capabilities at the expected rate, but acquisition of some capabilities delayed by impact of COVID-19. So that's important. It recognises that overall your progress has been okay, but actually we have to make some way of adjusting the outcome to recognise that you're going to have some targeted training and enable those competencies to be acquired. So that moves us to the 10.1 and the 10.2 because we've got two options. So I'll start with the 10.1. The 10.1 is a no fault outcome, and it's a bit like the outcome 2, the conventional outcome 2. And it's used for trainees who have not been able to demonstrate the capabilities, primarily because of COVID, and those capabilities can be made up at the next stage of training. So critically, a trainee on an outcome 10.1 can progress to the next stage of their training. And additional training is not required at this point, but might subsequently be required in the future. And that's really important. And one of the reasons we wrote into the ARCP derogation for the outcome 10 was specifically there has to be a very clear plan written down and explained to the trainee of how those requirements will be met. And that's really important because it will be followed up, whatever your outcome, with a meeting with your TPD or a representative of the panel to explain exactly what the outcome is and how we're going to address those competencies. And importantly, just like an outcome 2, if you disagree with the decision, you can ask for that decision to be reviewed. So it's subject to the review process. So moving on to the outcome 2, this is a no fault outcome, but it's very similar to the outcome 3. And this is used for trainees who are at a critical progression point and they've not been able to demonstrate required capabilities, and they cannot progress without those capabilities, and they cannot be made up at the next stage of training. So if you're at one of those critical progression points and say an exam has been cancelled by COVID and there hasn't been a derogation to your curriculum, which means that that competency can be made up at the next stage of training, you will require additional time that will be supported and enabled by the outcome 10. Of course, the highest stakes critical progression point is as you approach CCT. And there's nowhere to go at CCT. So unfortunately, that competency cannot be made up post CCT. And so trainees who cannot get their CCT because it's been impacted by COVID will be given an outcome 2. And as Colin will probably explain, we cannot make a recommendation to the GMC for a CCT on an outcome 10. You have to have an outcome 6 to get your CCT. So just as with an outcome 3, if you disagree with the outcome, it is subject to the appeal process. So a 10.2 is subject to the full appeal process. So now what I'd like you to do is, Helen is going to put up the flow chart for me, and I'm just going to walk you through the different stages of the ARCP process and the questions the panel will ask to decide which outcome they would give. So hopefully you can see the chart here, and you can see that there are basically 3 decision points. So the first thing that happens at your panel is the panel will ask themselves, based on the evidence, has the trainee met all the requirements for satisfactory progress or completion of their training programme? And if the answer is yes, you will go down the left-hand side of that flow chart. And if it's satisfactory progress, it's an outcome 1. And if it's all the requirements for completion of training, it's an outcome 6. There'll be a recommendation for a CCT, and they complete training and they can apply for specialist registration. But if the answer is no, then we move to the right-hand side. And at that point, the panel will say, well, why haven't the trainee been able to progress? And is it because of COVID? And there's a critical question here. The cut-off date for COVID was the 17th of March. That was when Simon Stevens repurposed the NHS, and that's when the government declared a high alert and a state of emergency. So if your training has been affected since the 17th of March, and that's been the reason that you've not been able to demonstrate progress, we would then move down and decide it would be an outcome 10. It's then a question of whether it's a 10.1 if you're able to progress and make up those competencies at the next stage of training, or an outcome 10.2 if you can't and you require additional time. And then finally, if the reason that the progression has been delayed is entirely unrelated to COVID, then it's the usual ARCP outcomes. So an outcome 2 with targeted training but no additional time, an outcome 3 where additional time is required, and for a small number of cases it may be an outcome 4. So I'm going to just leave it there, explain one more thing, and then I'm going to leave it for questions. A common question that I can anticipate is what happens if I use up all my available extension time? And I think this is really important. Deans can and will use their discretion to enable additional training time if the permitted limit is reached. And that might be now at the point of the COVID decision or subsequently in training. And for the majority of trainees who are affected by this, this is probably the first time they've required additional training. And so we may not need to use the discretion. But for a few who've required additional support in the past and additional training, that discretion has already been built into Gold Guide 8, and we will use it if necessary to support you in whatever you need. And finally, you may have seen that we've introduced a number of C codes. These are not a punitive tool or a stick to beat you with. This is really just a mechanism for the panels to be able to identify and explain the reasons why the outcome 10 has been given, and the multiple reasons that might account for why your progression has been delayed. And unlike the U codes which we have at the moment, you use as many C codes as you need to describe the reasons for the delay in your progression, whether it be to self-isolation, cancellation, exam, etc. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm sure that will invite a number of questions, which I am happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Jane, for explaining that so clearly. We're now going to pass over to Adrian to answer some of the questions that have already been submitted. But just before we do that, there was one comment which says, we've said that no one will be disadvantaged. Surely you mean that we're going to minimise the disadvantage. And it's a very good challenge, and being honest, that is what we're trying to do. We cannot guarantee in the time of a pandemic that nobody will be disadvantaged by there having been a pandemic, but we set out with the aim to make sure that no trainee was disadvantaged. But you're right to challenge us for saying that. And it has been our aim to minimise any disadvantages that there were, but I recognise the request for honesty in the question. And Carrie, I don't know if you want to say anything about the fact that colleges are very much trying to do the same.
Thanks very much, Shona. Yes, I think that's a very reasonable call out. I think that we are living in such strange times that we do sort of accept almost unanimously that this is having a disadvantage, having a poor disadvantageous effect on probably all of us. But no matter what, the purpose and the principles of each college is, as I mentioned earlier, to make sure that the impact is as minimal as it can be, particularly on the group of people that we really look to for our future, which is the trainees. So that's involved working very closely with all trainees, and particularly the Academy Doctors in Training group, that I know that anybody that works through each of the colleges and are accessible to all trainees at all times. And they have been very helpful in guiding us through a number of the processes, not just around about ARCPs, but also around about the recruitment processes, and also helping us as to how we can best execute exams, which I'm sure you can all imagine are going to be particularly difficult in the lack of face-to-face time, people wanting to travel, acceptability of including patients in exams, and so on and so forth. So absolutely, we want to make sure that the impact is minimalised as possible, and perhaps to say that no one's disadvantaged was a slight exaggeration, but I'm sure that you recognise that where we're coming from. So thanks very much for raising that. Back to Shona again.
Thank you, Carrie. So we now have some pre-submitted questions that Adrian Brooke's going to take us through first, and then I'll go on with more of the questions on Slido. So over to you, Adrian, to answer the questions you have, which were submitted beforehand.
Thank you, Shona. That's good. So we had some questions. Some questions have come up tonight, which I think may repeat similar themes, but I think some of the answers are probably worthy of hearing more than once. So to allow kind of reinforcement. So the first question that I'm answering here is come from a trainee saying, how long will the outcome 10 be available? And we know these are temporary measures, so we don't normally have an outcome 10. We usually have our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. But 10 this year. But we continue to discuss the situation and the outcomes, as we said at the outset, with all the colleges, with the other education bodies and with the regulator to really work out how long we are going to need them for. So whilst we can't give an exact estimate of how long this will be in place for, I think the principle is as long as it's needed because of the pandemic, we would expect really to be making arrangements accordingly to try and support that. So that may be later on in this year, it may possibly even be beyond. We are going to have to see. It's not possible to really predict for how long. The next question that we were sent is, how will trainees know what their outcome is and what will be done about it? What's the mechanism for giving a trainee additional training? So that's again very similar to what's happened in previous years. So I appreciate for some of you this may be your first year that you're doing an ARCP. For others, you would have done it several or even many times. So like any other year, you'll meet with someone from your faculty. That might be your educational supervisor, your training program director, a head of school, an associate of the postgraduate dean, or someone representing the postgraduate dean, to really talk about the outcome, where they would say, what your outcome was, why it was given, so go through the reasons, and then go through with you what the panel has indicated from the ARCP assessment, what they think the areas are that you need to be looking at to try and make up or address, and then to try and use that to plan what happens next in your next rotation or your next attachment, to try and make good any of those areas. Now we realise that moving forward, some of the attachments and rotations are going to have to be done in a slightly more imaginative way than perhaps hitherto, where if you're moving to another area, you may need to make up capabilities from a previous attachment area. So you may need to get some sessional exposure to either an outpatient clinic or a theatre list or some other sessional exposure in hours or maybe out of hours in order to give you the chance to attain those capabilities. And so it's also the opportunity to identify additional issues that are caused by the pandemic, and then identify from that the specific areas that you may have missed out on. So the third and final question that I've got here is that it says that the GMC has approved changes to decision aids with a time limit of May to August 2020. But what about training programs that have ARCPs in October and November? So I think that's very similar to the first question in a way, that we know the pandemic's ongoing. We know it'll be here and with us for some time, and we know that we are going to have to review the situation and do that within HE, with the other education bodies, with the regulator, the GMC, and with the colleges, and try and review things and move on them quickly to give you as much warning and notice as possible for what the arrangements will be. So we'll continue to review, we'll consider the progress of the pandemic, we'll keep talking, we'll keep working with the colleges, and we'll make the response accordingly. So, and I realise that is a bit of a repetition of the first answer. So that's into the questions that I was sent beforehand, and so I'll hand back to Shona. Shona.
Thank you, Adrian. We have similar questions about will the COVID outcomes continue to be available for next year's ARCP, because some trainees might take longer to make up the missing capabilities, and also new trainees who are shielding. So Colin, I was just going to ask you from the regulator's point of view about how long you're going to allow the outcome 10s to continue for. Just, I think, for you to give the regulatory view, though Adrian's already given our view of the question. Has he gone? So, waiting for Colin to come back, I have a question for Jane. which is someone has asked, which is better, an outcome 1 or an outcome 6? Or what does it mean? Which one would you want to have got? Which is a kind of more fun question. Which one do you think is better? And if you're looking at your job and if you're looking for recruiting in the future, would it matter if you had a 1.6 or a 10.1?
The answer is it depends on what stage of training you're at. An outcome 1 recognises satisfactory progress for the stage of training. So if you're still in your training, you would want an outcome 1. We will only give an outcome 6 because what an outcome 6 says is you've met all the requirements for satisfactory completion of training. So that's the outcome you want at the end of your training so that you can get your CCT. So one isn't better than the other. It's a question of what stage of training you're at when you want a satisfactory outcome. Outcome 10.1 and 10.2 are equivalent to the outcome 2 and outcome 3 respectively, and a lot of people regard those outcomes as non-standard or unsatisfactory outcomes, and I don't like the use of the language, and hopefully in the next version of the Goal Guide we will adjust that, because I think what we are signalling is outcomes 2 and 3 are supportive developmental outcomes to allow you the extra time if necessary and the extra training to make up the competencies that you haven't been able to make up. So again, I wouldn't have said an outcome 2 or 3 necessarily is a detriment to your training, because hopefully you'll get the support you need and then you can complete training satisfactory and then you're in a position to fulfill your chosen career.
Okay, thank you, Jane. And there has been a lot of work done by the colleges working with the GMC to change the criteria for progression into higher specialty training so that trainees can progress with their outcome 10 into higher specialty training. Colin, you dropped out when I was asking for the regulator's view as to how long you might have to have an outcome 10 for. I'm sure that wasn't you trying to escape the question, so I'm now going to pass to you to answer it.
Well, I can answer it. I don't think the video has come over to me. That's just typical too, isn't it? Let me speak anyway. Can people, I'm hoping people can hear me anyway. Yeah, so you couldn't make that up, could you? Just as a strategic question gets asked to the regulator gets disconnected. I don't know who queued that up, but it couldn't have worked at a more curious time. So look, it's a very serious question, and I'm not meaning to sound flippant in my response. Who knows how long this is going to go on for? So we've already started to do some work, and I've asked for some meetings with the lead people in the statutory education bodies so we can actually start addressing that very real question. There are some principles, of course, which I think are relevant here. One is that we've sort of pitched to say that we think it should be outcome, not time-based. So the key point is, can the evidence and can the time be made up in the remaining time without having to prolong training? We don't want prolonged training. That's not in any of our interests, is it? So we are looking at that, and we will come back with an extended or expanded position. I just checked our document on our website, and indeed, you're absolutely right. It says May to August 2020. And clearly there will be some of those decisions that roll over to September and October. So we need to make that clear. So I'll take that away and I'll have a look at it and make sure I come back to you. And you've not seen me, but I can see that Shona is still on the video, so I'll pass back to her.
I think we could all see you, Colin, even though you couldn't see yourself. So one of the first questions that we had now was from a trainee who is in neurology in his final year, her final year, and PYA was cancelled due to COVID. And the question is, if my ARCP outcome is satisfactory, would I be able to achieve a CCT without this? So over to Adrian to answer that one.
Hi, thank you, Shona. So the answer here is really about what the PYA is. So the PYA is actually slightly different from the ARCP. It's a way of preparing you to successfully complete all the components of the curriculum. So at the final ARCP, you've got all the capabilities required to gain your CCT. So providing you've managed to get all your curriculum capabilities or curriculum competencies at that final ARCP, all things being equal, the panel, if they agree with your assessments, they will issue an outcome 6, which is all capabilities required, and the programme is complete. So the PYA is not a statutory instrument in the way that an ARCP is. So the PYA itself, the absence of it, won't necessarily prevent you progressing.
Thank you, Adrian. One of the next questions we have is around the trainees who are missing capabilities because they're shielding or who have problems with catching up. And there are a few questions that cover what we're going to do to support trainees who find it difficult to gain all the competencies. So I know that this is something that colleges are very actively thinking about carrying out. I wanted to pass to you to comment on what colleges are thinking about how we support trainees to catch up on competencies and to gain competencies if they've got special circumstances like shielding.
Hi, Shona. I mean, I think this is one area that different colleges will have different strategies to, depending on the needs of the individual trainee, the stage they are at in their training, and what the competencies and capabilities that they have been unable to meet. I think this is compounded by the fact that there is the study leave has been suspended in a number of cases, which makes things difficult for people even to attend courses or do other things that might be needed. But people particularly who are shielding are a very broad group. They are anything from people who are actually very fit but have a condition which means that they would be increased risk should they become infected, to people who have some limitations and adjustments have already been made for them. And I think that the important thing is that each college and each specialty would have to take an individual approach to that, but the important thing would be that approach would be very sympathetic, with the main aim to make sure that people do not fall behind any further than they need to, but on the other hand are given the support that they need to make sure that they don't feel pressurised. So I think that under any circumstances, people should feel that they will get the support that they individually need, and it's done through two ways. Obviously, the direct support comes through the postgraduate deanery structure, TPDs, and educational supervisors, but the colleges also have their own mechanisms to make sure that each individual is picked up. I hope that answers the question for you, Shona. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. I think it's important that at the time when trainees are concerned about getting competencies and about the ARCP processes, that they know that we are all working in the colleges and in HE's offices and the dean's teams throughout the country to enable them to progress. One of the questions we've had is asking what will happen if a large proportion of trainees required an extension due to the COVID outcomes. Would this impact on recruitment numbers for next year? And if that happened, would that cause issues with lack of ability to get extensions or with rota gaps? And I think what this question is highlighting is the problems that we were facing at the beginning. If we did, which was as suggested, we just held everyone back till they could gain competencies and then allowed them to progress eventually. And what COVID has shown is that the world is unexpected, and we have faced a pandemic which the NHS has stepped up, and trainees have been a key part of that. And we've heard very clearly that people want to look to the future and want to progress. They don't just want to be held back. So all the work that's gone into ARCPs and the derogations by the GMC and colleges looking at variation has been to reduce the number of extensions we needed. Because if everyone extended, then it would affect recruitment numbers because we only have a certain number of training posts. But the work that we've done is to make sure that there is progression, there aren't any more rota gaps than we would expect, and that trainees can still get extensions to training when they need them. So I hope that's answered the question about what we're doing with regard to training, and what effect that will have on the whole system, and especially that it won't have any detrimental effect on a trainee that's requiring extension. Now, I've got a question for Jane, which I know you've answered, but I think it's helpful if we reiterate the answers to these questions, because the fact that we're getting more probably means it's good to say it twice. So why does the addition, where, or maybe it means where, why does the additional time for 10.2 for extension be limited if 10.2 is intended to be a no-fault outcome? Trainees feel that it's unfair that if they need extra training time from a 10.2, that counts. So can you answer it, Jane? I know you covered it, but can you answer that specifically for us, please?
Yeah. We tried in developing the derogation to make it as low as no fault as we possibly can, but as you've previously alluded to, we can't compensate for every eventuality, and trainees inevitably will be affected by COVID. I mean, for example, you can't get your CCT, and therefore you might miss out on your consultant appointment, and there's no way we can actually negate that, the way that you have been potentially disadvantaged by COVID. So what we have tried to do, and the facility is there through the derogation, is Gold Guide has already defined and the maximum duration of additional training time, and it very much depends on your specialty and your training programme. And there'll be a very small proportion of trainees who reach that limit and therefore potentially would be disadvantaged. But the discretion that we've built into the Gold Guide enables deans to exercise their discretion to give additional time over and above those permitted limits if the trainee requires it. And because we already had that discretion there that enables to optimise that no fault capacity, if you like, we really didn't feel that we needed to build in additional discretion into the wording of the 10.2 or the management of extensions guidance document that we later published. So we've tried to make it as no fault as we possibly can, and deans would not unreasonably deny that discretion to enable trainees additional time if they needed it, and to be able to support them to get to the point where they can progress and they can complete training satisfactorily.
Thank you, Jane. Now, this is another question that I think we have covered, but to be clear about it, The question says, my final ARCP was due in August, but due to COVID, it's now at the end of August. And this trainee will be sitting the AKT in August and wants to know how long the rules with regards to the workplace-based assessment and the reduced number of workplace-based assessments that are required will apply. So it's again a question of whether the derogations that have been put in place will apply in August. So Adrian, I'll just ask you to answer that.
Thank you. So thank you, Shona. So yes, it is kind of depends on where the ARCP, whether that particular capability is derogated in that particular curriculum. And this is one of the reasons, of course, that it's tricky to get into very individual answers to questions for individual curriculum, because even though I think many of us on this call feel totally immersed in ARCPs, we still don't know every single curriculum line by line and what exact derogations have been made where. So I would advise you to talk to your faculty to really try and understand if that derogation has been made or not. So it's a fairly specific question. If it's a workplace-based assessment, often the principle is if you can proxy satisfactory progress from a range of other measures apart from the previously specified exact number, then that's one of the principles that the individual college curricular groups have tried to apply in order to show flexibility for the curricula for the ARCP at that stage. If it's an exam which is an absolute requirement, then that's rather harder to obviously surmount.
Thank you, Adrian. And I think with regard to workplace-based assessments, there is a derogation from the RCGP if it's a GP question. And I presume with regard to the other ones that would remain in place in August. But with all of this, it's a challenge for your training program directors, for the colleges to keep them informed, and for you to adapt to the changing rules. We know that, and ARCP panels will be sympathetic towards that, but it's always helpful to keep checking in with your supervisor and TPD to check to see what the rules mean for you specifically. Now, there is a question about IMT training and the fact that some trainees have been able to complete their ITU placement. And the minimum number of this weeks might not be achieved. And will the outcome 10 be able to extend through future years to enable people to get their ITU component of the internal medicine training? Adrian, do you want to comment on what we're doing for that?
Yes, thank you, Shona. So again, this does partly relate to the earlier point about how long will the derogations hold for, which I think Colin has already indicated that we are all looking at whether we will need to continue this for a little while. We know that the introduction of ITU placements for IMT was always going to be a difficult first step. And we were looking to show, if you like, capability-based outcomes rather than time-based outcomes. So if you've not managed to attain the exact number of weeks, but you've managed to demonstrate the capabilities, and one of the issues arising out of the pandemic, of course, is a lot of people have become actually much more familiar with intensive care processes and capabilities than perhaps they were planning. So if you have the capability, if you haven't got the exact number of weeks, I think that's sort of area where the ARCP panel would be looking at your workplace-based assessments, your records of which areas you've attained, to see if they can use that in order to assess whether you have those capabilities or not. Regardless of whether you've got the exact number of days on the intensive care unit. And with that, back to Shona.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm trying to go down the questions in line, but as they jump around due to how popular you think they are, there's a delay in me responding. So I have a question here for Jane. If you're shielding from March to August, should you have an ARCP or should it be deferred due to illness? And if you have an ARCP, are you automatically facing an outcome 10?
Oh, that's a really good question, and not an easy one to answer. I suppose it depends on how your shielding status is regarded. If you're shielding and it is being regarded as sick leave, then you're quite right, is that you wouldn't normally have an ARCP during a period of sick leave, or at least you'd have a calendar review and it would just be documented on an outcome 8, is that they couldn't achieve they couldn't reach a decision on progress because you were absent from programme due to illness. But there are a number of trainees who are shielding and have still been able to participate in their training programme and do some work that actually could be recognised as part of their competencies. And I know it's difficult, but I suspect for those trainees that they should still put themselves forward for an ARCP and submit the evidence that they have. And it may be appropriate to give them a 10.1 that recognises that when they come out of shielding, because of course there may be, just as if you're out on maternity leave, a need to make up the time element which just moves your CCT date on. So that's not a formal extension, but it's just a rescheduling of your CCT. So I think it's important, if you're in that group, that you do have the evidence assessed, and that if there is a competency gap, you are supported in whatever way is appropriate to meet that competency gap.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Jane. And I think we've had a question saying, does the extension apply to targeted trainees? And we presume that the targeted means trainees that are shielding. If someone who's asked that question meant something different, if they want to re-ask it, we'll try and answer it. Now, a number of you are saying that there was an issue with the slide showing, so we will make sure we issue that afterwards so that everyone's been able to see it. And we now have a question which highlights the difficulties. It's very difficult to create an action plan for those given 10.1 when we don't know when training is going to be able to resume. We don't know how it will be affected by continued remote working, and whether there'll be a second wave and when shielding trainees can return. And I think you could call that the training program director or the ARCP panel's lament, because it is just highlighting how difficult it is going to be for people trying to do the best for trainees to put in place perfect training. And we will all have to work both in trusts and in deaneries and in colleges to try and take things forward in a way that makes it easy. But I think there isn't a solution to that. I acknowledge that that's very difficult, and I think all we can do at the minute is acknowledge that and all work to try and make it better. I'm going to hand over to Adrian, who wants to make a comment.
Yes, thank you, Shona. I think it's a really good question, and this is a little bit like predicting the weather, isn't it? So I think that the safest thing that we can all do here is make sure that you have a really close dialogue with your educational supervisor, with your TPD, with your head of school, with people in the faculty. So part of the planning we talked about when you've got your ARCP outcome is a presumptive plan based on everything restarting, a more normal pattern. If that's interrupted, you need an early meeting to say, what do I do now? How does this affect me? How's this going to affect my progress? And those early discussions will help inform what capabilities you can get where you are, how they can contribute to making up previous capabilities and towards the next set on your curriculum journey, to try and, if not minimise the impact, at least ensure that everyone's sight is on how you and the faculty are trying to manage it. So that's what I want to say, that it's a really good question. We don't know the answer, but the key here is clear and regular dialogue with your faculty. I'll hand back to Shona. Thank you.
So I have a question asking for trainee shielding who've not yet been able to get back to clinical work. I may not be able to for a long time before they can return. How can we help them? And we have a comment from a trainee who feels the needs and well-being of shielding trainees have largely been abandoned, and is representing 50 other trainees like themselves. What are we going to do about making sure the ARCP process is supportive and that TPDs are considering our mental health and well-being? So I think this is a question for both the Academy and for us. Adrian, do you want to comment from HE's point of view, and then I can pass to Carrie?
Sure. Thank you, Shona. That's again a really good question, and this has arisen already. And I think for trainees who are shielding, there are also contractual and employment issues as well, which serve to complicate the issue. The principle, I think, is a regular dialogue with your faculty. We don't want to ignore you, or the education bodies don't want to ignore you. And one of the things that we've all learned as part of the pandemic is, if you like, there are opportunities for undertaking service that aren't necessarily face-to-face. So the kind of revolution in remote clinics, in remote reporting, in other remote technologies, the massive upswing in the usage of e-learning for healthcare and other e-learning platforms has meant that actually access to some aspects of the curriculum and to demonstrate some capabilities are possible even if you're not face-to-face with patients. So some aspects of the curriculum may be achievable, and it's worth having that early discussion with your training program director or educational supervisor about how you might actually attain that. I think in the case of someone who is shielded, we will do everything we can to support you at this stage. We will need to keep the whole situation under review as we move forward and as the situation changes, to make sure we can carry on supporting you as best as possible. I'll hand back to Shona after that. Thank you.
Carrie, is Carrie on?
Yes, I think I'm back. I dropped out for a short while. Internet issues.
So Carrie, did you hear that question? Is that there's concern about the support that we're giving to shielding trainees? It's a question for HE, but I do think it's one that you may want to respond on behalf of the colleges.
Yes, thank you. I did hear what Adrian said, and I completely concur with everything. This is, as we've said so many times, a very strange situation that we find ourselves in. And because of that strangeness, people have been able to work and act very quickly about things, and therefore things have changed in many ways. The way we deliver care has changed, and therefore there may be opportunities with virtual consultations, telephone consultations, depending on what specialty people are involved in. Mechanisms that people can use in order to get different forms of teaching. But the other thing is, as well, is it's the importance of keeping in touch with both peers and with educational supervisors, TPDs, and with the local structures. And within the Academy, we have a page of, where people can find support under any different forms of circumstances, whether it's through difficulties in workplace, or whether it's through stress, or anything really that's available. If you go to the Academy, there's a comprehensive area where people can get support should they not feel that they want to contact somebody directly, or they don't feel able to do so. But personal contact is almost certainly the best way. Back to Shona at that.
Thank you, Carrie. Now we have a couple of questions that I'm going to pass to Jane, and I think you also have some noted down, Jane. There, one of the questions was, are there only 2 outcomes for the summer, or can you still get an outcome 1? And the other one is, can you clarify the ARCP process for less than full-time trainees? So can I pass you 2 questions at once, plus some others that I think you have a note of, if you'd like to do them?
Okay. There aren't only 2 outcomes, and basically it's the full range of options in the summer. So it may be an outcome 10, outcome 10.1 or 10.2, but we've still got it's still possible to get a satisfactory outcome if you've met an outcome 1. And indeed, we've got, if it's possible to use the usual ARCP outcomes, we will use those. So I think that's sort of answered that question. Just remind me what the second question was.
Less than full-time training.
Full-time.
Is there anything different?
No, there's nothing different. I mean, we a while ago adjusted it so that it's assessed on the evidence is assessed on a pro rata basis in terms of the number of assessments, and that's very much set by the particular specialty or faculty in their decision aids. But you still have to have a calendar ARCP on a yearly basis in the same way that other trainees do. But your critical progression points, so your progression ARCPs, will be assessed on a pro rata basis. So at the stage of training in terms of whole time equivalent, when you reach those weighing points, and that hasn't changed due to COVID. I'm just slightly alarmed that I don't have a copy of the questions that I agreed to answer. So I'm a bit in the dark there.
Thank you, Jane. I'll keep passing you questions. You don't need to be given any more at the minute. Thank you. So one of the comments we have is that colleges can't fully support shielding unless they have clearer guidance from bodies such as HEE. And there's a question asking, where do you find out about derogations by colleges for ARCP requirements such as exams? So if you are looking to find out where the different college derogations are, where would someone find that? Which website would you find that on? Is there somewhere trainees can look to for that? Colin or Carrie, can you answer that?
I mean, I can offer a comment, which is it's one of the things that we picked up just before this meeting, is trying to identify all of the derogations that have been made and bring them together in one place. And I'm sure we can work with the Academy to do that. But I would suggest that in the first place, people go to their own specialty or college websites, where I would hope that that sort of thing would be published. We certainly have published all the headline changes on the GMC's website, and they should be easily accessible. I might stick out a tweet after this just to indicate where that web page is for you.
Thank you, Colin. And talking of tweets, Helen has tweeted the flowchart, so you should be able to find that. Now, we have a document on the HE website that we are trying to update with all the web links to college websites, where you will be able to find the information. Now, there's a new question. Would you support the use of 10.2 at non-critical progression points, for example, in obstetrics and gynecology, where there are specific targets for each training year, elective gynecology operating? Can I only use an outcome 3 if the trainee really needs additional training time and is not at a critical progression point? Now, that's a nice complicated question. But it's, can you use this at non-critical progression points? Can you use the 10.2? Jane or Adrian, who wants to answer that one? Adrian's waving. Adrian's on mute.
Sorry. That's a really good question. I'll answer it. Jane may want to make further comments. The point about a 10.2 really is based around whether either the curriculum doesn't permit you to progress, because we haven't managed to get derogations against things that you definitely need. So that might be an exam or a particular capability to progress to the next stage of training. And that would be a 10.2 if the reason you didn't get it is because of the impact of the pandemic. If the reason you didn't get it was not due to the impact of the pandemic, then that would be an outcome 3, baldly. If you can pick up those capabilities later on, or the curriculum has got derogations, which means you can progress and pick them up later, it's a 10.1 and it's additional time again. So remember, 10.1 and the 10.2 are both additional time. They just recognise, if you like, the limits of where you can gain extra capability. There are sort of principles behind the 10.2. So one of them clearly is you can't progress because if you were to progress, that's not good for patient safety. I mean, clearly a really important principle. The other principle is for your own well-being. If it was going to put an intolerable strain on you because of the burden of assessments or additional capabilities you would need to make up in a very short space of time, that might make, that's the other principle which we consider about the 10.2. Or you lack a critical competence, for example, an exit exam or a progression exam. So those are the main reasons why a 10.2, if you like, the principles behind the use of a 10.2. A 10.1 still gives you additional time. It's more akin to an outcome 2 in old parlance, if you like. Jane may want to make further comments. If not, I'll hand back to Shona. Thank you.
Jane, has Adrian covered that, or do you want to comment?
He's covered it absolutely fine. I mean, the only thing is the 10.1 doesn't explicitly give you extra time, but at that particular point, but you may require additional time in the future. And again, this comes back to the sort of flexibility and discretion. If there's local flexibility and additional time can be given on an outcome 10.1, there is no barrier to that. I mean, the whole idea is that you are supported in whatever way is required to meet the competency gap that's resulted in the situation due to COVID. And really, I wouldn't fret too much about whether it's a 10.1 or a 10.2. We will do what we can to make sure that you get the training you need to progress.
Thank you, Jane. Now, a new question, where a minimum reduced data set has been set by a college, does completion of this mean an outcome 1 or 10? And will those missing competencies that were dropped in the reduced data set then be required to be made up later on in training, or will they never be required? So, Colin, would you be happy to answer this as it relates to the derogation?
Yeah, absolutely, Shona, thanks. It's a really important question. So the whole point here is that 10.1 allows you to progress on the assumption that we believe that it's outcome-based, not time-based, and therefore the likelihood is that in the next period of training, you'll be able to make up missing competencies. What we've then said is, if colleges believe that there should be a derogation to reduce the requirements, then the challenge back from us is, if you're going to do it on a temporary basis, why do you need to put it back again? So you shouldn't find yourself in a position where there's a temporary derogation without a good reason that allows someone to progress and then gets put back in. We've actually published our own summary advice on the use of 10.1, 10.2 in our policy piece, which is under the section on the GMC website on information for trainees. I can tweet that out too if you like, which I hope is helpful. Basically sets out that the idea is you carry on as if everything is normal on the assumption that you'll be able to make up what's missed, whether it's a reduced set or a full set. But I hope that's helpful anyway. Back to you, Shona.
So, Colin, there's a follow-up question, Colin, which is saying, will areas of the specialty curriculum be reviewed in view of COVID? Someone's mentioning having to attend a transplant department. So I think what we can say is that the curriculum is being reviewed, but do you want to specifically answer that as the regulator that approves the curriculum?
This is obviously so everyone can quote me later. I'm absolutely sure of that. I can see my co-presenters all nodding furiously. So I think what this has exposed is a very interesting question. I noticed, of course, that in the summer there was going to be an ASME conference on disrupting medical education, but coronavirus has obviously got there first. And I think it's asking some really challenging questions. And one of those questions for me is, how do we make judgments about progression? And what's the difference between stuff that you do, the number of items you've got, and how you demonstrate competency? And those things are not the same, certainly not in my mind. So that question about attending a transplant clinic, I would be asking, what's the purpose of that? And I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, by the way, please understand that. But what's the purpose of that, and how does it relate to developing a competency? Or is it simply a phenomenon that we're saying, well, you have to do this and you get a tick in the box and then you can move on? I think those are some really critical questions that we've all got to ask ourselves about what makes up a curriculum and what makes a competent doctor for access to the specialty or GP register. Really critical questions. I don't have an answer for you tonight, but we're certainly working on it.
Thank you, Colin. So we have a question here for outcome 10. For outcome 10, we'll have to look at ARCP decision aids. If you have a decision aid, how strictly do you need to follow the decision aid? Is there an exact cutoff, the number of clinics required? So the question is, how strictly do you need to follow the decision aid? Is it a guide or is it the law? Adrian, do you want to answer that one?
Yes, yes, thank you, Shona. Of course I do. The idea is that panel forms a view, and the clue is in the name of the Gold Guide. It's a guide. It's not a statutory instrument. You won't be sent to prison if, as a member of the panel, you make a judgment based on a number of clinics, for example, which is slightly less than that has been previously stipulated in the curriculum, if the derogation allows you to do so. I mean, that is the whole point of the derogation. So I think it's an example where it's really worth reading the curriculum, talking to the SAC, if you're part of that machinery, as it were, in order to understand what the leeway in the derogation is, and to seek advice if you're unsure around the panel. That's why we have panels, so it's not a sole person making the decision. It's will be at least one other person making a collective judgment on whether your experience that you've demonstrated in your e-portfolio for attending a number of learning opportunities and demonstrating those capabilities amount to a capability that can assure the panel that you are safe to progress. Really very similar to the answer that Colin was given earlier. So with that, I think that's all I want to say at this stage, and perhaps hand you back now to Shona. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. We have a question. Where are the new decision aids on the JRC-PTB website and the GMC one? They can only find the old ones. So Colin has offered to tweet where things are on the GMC website, and there's a COVID section on the JRC-PTB website. In the JRC-PTB COVID section of the website, you can find the amended decision aids. Now, one of the questions we've been asked is, how are we going to ensure consistency between regions when deciding on exceptional training time? So when we decide at the minute, I suppose, Jane, one of the things I want to ask you first is, how do we ensure we have some kind of consistency with the goal guide? And how will we achieve consistency with giving additional training time? So it's part of, how do we achieve that normally, and how might we achieve that at the minute? You need to take your mute off. You're still on mute, Jane. You're still on mute, Jane.
It's down.
No, we can hear you now.
Oh, great. Sorry about that. I slipped out the internet connection. Basically, the goal guide is an agreed framework for a consistent approach in decision making by deans across all 4 nations. And there's an agreement, although it is a guide, there is an agreement that we will follow that framework, and where there's a derogation to that, or you deviate it from it, you can justify your reasons for the inconsistency, if you like. And what we've done in agreeing the way that extensions will be managed and exceptions might be made is we've actually, as part of that overarching guidance, we've agreed a set of principles that deans in exercising this discretion should follow, so that we can try and achieve that consistency across the 4 nations. So there's for example, if you are going to apply the exception criteria to give additional time, there's an expectation that there's a certain amount of evidence that the deans would require before they could make that decision, to inform that decision. So, for example, we would want to be assured that there's a realistic prospect that, given the extra time, the trainee is progressing at a rate that they will hit the required level. And that's not just for us to be punitive about that, is that we've got to think of the welfare of the trainee. in that, is it fair to put somebody through additional training and they've already had additional training if there isn't a realistic prospect that they will benefit from that additional time? But those are the measures that we've set in place. With more than 20 different deaneries across the UK, inevitably people will do things slightly differently, and I think there's no way that we can legislate from that other than the commitment the deans have given to abide by the agreed overarching framework that's designed to give that consistency.
Thank you, Jane. And all regions are giving training to panels. All regions are giving training to panels, and there is a video that we have shared to try and get an understanding and consistency of approach. And there's a paper on the CopMed website that gives guidance on the additional training time. Now, we're being asked about some of the questions that were forwarded to us from the colleges. If we don't get them all done by the time the webinar finishes, because we're trying to answer some of the ones coming in, we will provide answers directly back to Carrie in the Academy. Or we'll answer some of them now, as my screen keeps jumping around and I can't see where the next question's gone. So there's one which asks, the outcome 3 is already included as a no-fault provision. So does the desire to create a new outcome suggest that the outcome 3 is seen as a universally negative outcome? No, it doesn't. As Jane says, it was in response to trainees wanting a clear indication for COVID, and in discussions that we had across the 4 nations involving trainees, it was identified that there is a need for an outcome in these exceptional times. I think everything that we're doing at the minute makes us question whether the processes we have need to be looked at again. And what's the best outcome is part of what we will continue to do after this. There is a question which says, will colleges prioritise exam sittings for trainees who are concerned that they won't get additional training time? I think, Carrie, do you want to comment on how colleges are approaching exams?
Yes, thank you very much. Exams are quite a significant challenge, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this webinar, and the capacity to deal with the numbers is one of the challenges that lies ahead. I can't speak for absolutely every college because I haven't had this conversation with them all, but the messages I'm getting so far are very much that trainees within the UK are going to be prioritised for exams where there is a limited number of places available. And as with all situations, they will tend to prioritise. This is a generalisation, but it does seem to be the message that I get from colleges, that they do prioritise people who have been held up for any particular reason or who are at a critical stage in moving forward. So again, I would suggest that if there's any query around about that, contact the college directly they'll know the situation that any individual might be in, but it's certainly worth having a conversation with them. But as I think we've mentioned, I've mentioned and other people have mentioned, and it is very important that you do recognise this, that the individuals, this is a mass response to a very difficult situation, but we have not lost sight of the individual in these circumstances. Thanks, Shona.
So we have a number of other questions asking, can we reassure trainees about shielding? And a lot of what we've covered has related to shielding trainees, but I think what it highlights is that we need to be putting out clearer messages, and this is something that we will all address after the webinar, because it's clear that it is an area of significant concern, and that people want clearer guidance and reassurance from us. So we will we'll continue to note the questions about this and put up some more guidance on it. Now, I'm still getting questions. How have the views of trainees been accessed with regard to ARCP trainees? With regard to ARCP changes, how do we try and access what trainees think? So colleges have been working with their trainee representative groups. Carrie, do you want to mention that the Academy also has a trainee group? We do try and sense check with the BMA as the trainee representatives, a trainee representative body, the BMA Junior Doctor Committee, and who are very happy to give us positive and negative feedback on changes that we are proposing, and I feel we try and listen as much as we can. We would like to have engaged much more fully with trainees, but there has been some pressure, so perhaps we could have listened more, but it has definitely been a focus. And Carrie, do you want to comment on how the Academy incorporates the trainee opinion?
Yes, thanks, Shona. I agree that we have done our best to engage with trainees, as I think we always do try to do. But again, recognising that this whole thing has only been underway for 10 weeks, it has been challenging. That said, the trainees who are representing each college have been interacting with their individual colleges, and as I mentioned earlier, the ADTG, the Academy Junior Doctors group, Doctors in Training group, have been invaluable in this process. They have been challenging. We have not been allowed to get away with anything. They have been informative. Have been able to place their own view and the view of each individual specialty, and make sure that we haven't missed out anything that has not been entirely relevant. So I think that we absolutely 100% value the trainee input. And we couldn't have done it without them, quite frankly. There've been some things that we've thought might work quite well, and having had full and frank discussions, we've identified that why they wouldn't work well. I think that with that in mind, we've reached it's not perfect, I imagine, but it's a compromise that we hope will work. Thanks. Back to you, Shona.
Thank you, Carrie. So one last question I'm going to answer is, can international trainees apply for a government visa extension if they get an outcome 3? And the reason I'm choosing to answer it is because it's a yes, and I can answer it quickly. Now, we are out of time, though not out of questions. We still have the questions from Slido. As I said, a significant number relate to concerns about how we will support trainees to get extra competencies and how we will support shielding trainees. So we will look at providing more information about that. We'll feed back to the colleges on some of the questions that we've received. And it may be that we need to have another webinar depending on how many questions we can answer for you over the next week. I'd like to thank the panel who have been answering the questions, and I'd like to thank you all for listening in to try and be clearer, both trainers and trainees, about how you should approach training to get the best out of it and the best outcomes. So Thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and thank you so much to the presenters who've given up their time to answer the questions.